Recently, I came across a study in Human Resource Executive magazine that asked human resource executives, what are the issues that keep you up at night? The number one issue that was identified is this quote, HR leaders are laser focused on hiring and retention. And here's a supporting quote from the article that PwC recently estimated about 20% of all workers would quit throughout the year. We've heard a lot about this notion of the great resignation and quiet quitting, and we find that 47% of our HR respondents in the study cited hiring and retaining key talent as their most pressing challenge. And this is interesting to me because I've been doing employee experience work for well over 2 decades. And whenever I've gone into companies to talk to them about why do you want to study employee experience, the most frequent response for most of those years was, we want to understand how employee experience impacts our customer experience because of the whole notion of happy employees leading to happy customers. In the last couple of years, the discussion has completely changed where now this whole area of how do I hire and retain my key talent, that's number one. I mean, that's the number one thing that people are talking about. And I'll ask my colleague, Zach, to comment on that because I know that you've been in this very position of trying to hire and retain key talent in your role as Chief Human Resource Officer.
Yeah, the war for talent has been going on for some time. And it existed, I think, more on the recruitment front than on the retention front. Yeah, we wanted to retain our employees, but when it came to hiring new folks, there's a limited pool of healthcare workers in any marketplace. And that pool shrunk tremendously with COVID. So a lot of early retirees, people getting out of the bedside business, really put a crimp in healthcare, creates a lot of wage pressure. So the idea that we look at retention with another level of concern and to try to put some metrics to it. When it comes to recruitment, we have tons of metrics, SEO metrics, where is our source of hire. We do a lot of recruitment metrics. What's the metric on retention? Turnover. Why is there turnover? How do you measure it? How do you prevent it? And where are the metrics around prevention? And I think that's something that we have here in this study, and we'll show you in our webinar today. So it's really exciting information because it measures something that I don't think we've done a good job of measuring in the past. How do you get people to stay?
Well, we know that there have been a lot of studies in this whole area of why people quit their jobs. And there's a lot of reasons why people cite, and a lot of people, I think, are talking now about the need for greater compensation, and certainly developmental opportunities have always been among the reasons why people have left their jobs. But one of the things that we know is a key reason why people leave, and it's really the focus of our study today, is that people really don't feel that they have been adequately recognized for their hard work. They basically, don't feel like they've been appreciated. They don't feel like they've been recognized for the quality of work they do. Let me go to this slide. This is a recent study, Zach, I know that you've identified from the MIT Sloan School of Management that shows what's driving the Great Resignation. And certainly one of those factors right at the top, we talk about toxic corporate culture, but part of that obviously is that whole notion of the failure to recognize performance. And I think you can probably even tie that into some of these other factors like job insecurity and reorganization, that people don't feel like they're appreciated for what they do.
Yeah, I think as HR folks, we know this. We know that people want to be recognized, and we don't do recognition well, that if we recognize people more and incentivize them more, perhaps with spot awards and with other kinds of recognition, that they will do a better job, beat a path to our doors. But how do you prove it? How do you show it? This study from MIT really shows that people are leaving relative to compensation 2.9 times more than compensation itself. Can we go back to the last slide for a second, Rick? Because there was something in there that I wanted to point to. The second bullet point I think is really interesting. That 59% of people who receive consistent recognition would recommend their companies to others as a place to work. And if we go back to what is our main source of talent in healthcare, more and more, maybe not even more and more, forever and ever, it was internal referrals. internal referrals. And now candidates know a lot more about us than they did beforehand. So we have to create cultures where people feel wanted and recognized. But that also will spur referrals, and that's where we'll get the majority of our talent in the future. It's not from SEO. It's not from per-click advertising. It's from referrals and the reputation of our business and our business leaders as people who care for their staff as much as they care for their patients.
Well, Zach, let me amplify that a bit and talk about this WorkProud study. This is a study that we did a little over a year ago, and we're preparing. We're certainly having discussions now about doing a new updated version of this study. But we looked at a lot of different areas among 1,000 full-time employees across a wide variety of industries. What we found out is that only 1 out of 5 people that we talked to in this study strongly agreed that they're consistently recognized in ways that are important, compared to 43% of respondents who said that they weren't recognized consistently in meaningful ways. So it's like a 2-to-1 margin in the wrong direction. Now,
and 43%,
in addition to
43% saying they're not being recognized. Pay attention to me. I'm doing good work. I'm taking care of your patients, and you're not even recognizing me. Maybe there's a population that shouldn't be recognized. It's not 43% of our workforce.
Well, and I think, to your point, you talked about the idea that people who are consistently recognized are much, much likelier by a 6-to-1 margin, right, to recommend their company as a place to work to others. But in this whole retention issue, to me, these other two statistics are incredibly telling. 2/3 of that high recognition group, that 20% who said that they were consistently recognized, strongly agreed that they would be very happy to spend the rest of their career with their current employer, compared to only 15% of the group that received little or no recognition. So I've often been asked, well, how many people want to spend the rest of their career with their current company? Well, if you're consistently recognized, it's 2 out of 3. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to have the same job for the rest of your career, but you certainly recognize that you're working for a company with a culture that warrants a long-term commitment. And then the one that is my favorite statistic that I have here bolded, because it really goes back to this whole notion of, well, people leave for more money. Half of the people in the high recognition group strongly agreed that even if offered significantly more money to do the same work, they would choose to stay with their present employer, compared to only 8% who received little or no recognition. Now, I think the 8% who said that in the low recognition group probably checked the wrong box in the survey. But, it's certainly amazing when we look at half the people in that 20% who were strongly recognized said that they would stay at the present company, even if they were offered significantly more money to go elsewhere. So again, back to the previous slide, or this slide that we talked about before, about 3 times as likely to leave an organization due to poor recognition practices as opposed to compensation. Very, very telling statistics. Okay, so let's talk about this particular case study today. We've been recently reading about a lot of nurses going on strike in New York. And there was even an unresignation letter that was published as an emotional plea for nurses to stay in their jobs. And the quote was, "It's not in a nurse's nature to quit, but thousands of us did. Something needs to change." Now, you've served as the Chief Human Resources Officer for a large medical system in New Jersey. And this is data that we've been able to access through the online rewards tool. We're focusing this study on healthcare today, and specifically the nursing population. But we can do this kind of analysis across other organizations. In fact, I've been working with Michael to do this very thing. So we can look at this today as a specific industry and a specific profession, but understanding that this is something that we can see universally applied across other industries as well. So we started off with 60,000 employee records. Now, what we did is we basically eliminated anybody that stayed less than 30 days or people who were recent hires. The 60,000 people included 13,411 staff nurses, we collected this data through the online rewards, the WorkProud tool, for 3.5 years, from 2019 through the fall of 2022, over 44 months, 15 quarters, over 3.5 years of records. So through this tool, we were able to track actual recognition through the electronic systems, along with the start date, end date, and current employment status. And what that allowed us to do was to actually pair recognition and overall turnover. And so this isn't just perceptual. This isn't just that people think they're being recognized or not. This is actual data based on the amount of times people were recognized through this formal online tool. So we looked at, as I said, people who were with the company at least 30 days. So we didn't want to look at early hires or early quits in the analysis. And from that, we found some really, really interesting things. Over that 3.5 year period, 58% of the people that received no recognition, which was 21% of this particular population, 58% of those people left the organization, compared to 34% who received any recognition at all. Now, if you do the math, that's an average of 16% annual turnover in the no recognition group, compared to 9% annual turnover in the group that received any recognition whatsoever. And we understand that recognition has more or less impact depending on the kind of job you do and whether you're a frontline employee. And from that, we looked at the nursing population. Now, when we do the math on what this means, over 12,000 people received no recognition over the 3.5 year period. As I mentioned, that's 21% of employees. Of that group, 58% left the company within the 3.5 year period. Now, that comes to 7,107 people that received no recognition and left the company. So I'll try not to make people's heads explode with the math here, but follow along. So compared to those who had been recognized, the turnover was 71% higher. So 58% versus 31% represents 71% greater turnover within that 3.5 year period. Now, with all other things being equal, if we expected that turnover at 34%, that would have projected 4,180 employees versus the 7,107 who actually left. When you look at that difference, it's the difference between 27 employees, the people that were in that high turnover group that left with no recognition, versus the group that received at least some recognition over that period. Now, again, what we would not say, and what we would not stick our necks out so far and say, is that the people in that group, that 58% that left that received no recognition, that they only left because they received no recognition. But what we can say is that there was an extreme difference between the people that got recognition versus those who didn't. SHRM comes up with a formula that basically says that it costs the company 6 to 9 months of an employee's salary to replace him and her. So when you do the math and you calculate all this out together, and happy to go over the math for anybody who would like to connect with me offline in case this is going too quickly. What it comes down to is basically $23 million to $36 million annually in the additional turnover costs of that no recognition group versus the recognition group. Now, that's for the entire population. When we look specifically at the nursing population, what we see is essentially for every level of recognition you get, turnover goes down. Now, this has been annualized. We've got 5 different groups here, and they're all based on quartile. So we take the top 25%, the next 25%, and so far down in terms of the amount of recognition that people have received. We split the bottom group, the bottom 25, into a group that received no recognition at all versus very minimal recognition. And we'll get into what that looks like in just a minute. But what you see is that every single level, as you increase the amount of recognition, you decrease the percentage of annual turnover. Now, when you look at the nursing population, you see that 15% that receive, basically turnover among the no recognition group. It was 9% in this particular case in the nursing population that didn't receive any recognition at all, and 15% of that group annual turnover. Now, when you look at the next group up, that drops 12% turnover and so forth as you go up the line, and as you give more recognition, you see turnover reducing even further. Now, let's break into what those numbers actually mean. If you move from the no recognition group to the minimal recognition group, there's a difference in annual turnover employee replacement cost between those tiers of 1.4 million to 2.2 million in the nursing population alone. If you go that next level, the minimal recognition, and this is people who are recognized a few times, to the modest recognition group, the difference in turnover cost now goes from 2.8 to 4.2 million. The modest recognition group, and now you're to the point of people who are, getting closer to sort of what the average looks like. Modest recognition to 4 million, to more recognition, is a difference between 1.6 to 2.4 million. And the people who get some recognition, not a small amount, but comparing them to the people, the top 25% who get the most recognition, now the annual turnover, replacement cost is the difference between the modest group and the more group and the most group is 1.4 to 2.1 million. So all the way up the line, as you increase the amount of recognition, you decrease turnover, and those are the associated costs that are associated with the reduced turnover percentages in this nursing population.
When Michael and Rick first presented this study to me and showed me the effect of recognition on turnover, and that we could measure this really scientifically. Behind the scenes, this isn't asking people's opinion. This isn't asking people to fill out a survey. This is marrying the recognition data that flows through the WorkProud app as compared to the HRIS. And we could then go with an observed and expected turnover rate. Very scientific, not subjective at all, highly objective. And what we found matched the WorkProud study, but more importantly, I think what it matches is what we as HR professionals have known for years, that recognition is never enough. And that if we can add more to it, make our programs more exciting, more dynamic, more available, with something actually behind it in terms of perhaps some manager discretionary awards, peer-to-peer recognition, a lot of the tools that our app allows organizations to use, all of a sudden we can compare data in a scientific way, and we see what we've known. But and I think that this idea that recognition is good and that it works and that we don't do enough of it is shared by our colleagues in the C-suite. I think they all know that. But here's a way to show it. Here's where we actually take the recognition data in a scientific way and compare it to the amount of recognition. And when we move, as in the slide you're seeing on the screen right now, from no recognition up to modest recognition, we are saving millions and millions of dollars on an annual basis. Yeah, there's some diminishing return at the top end. Let's face it, our people who are probably getting the most recognition are our most engaged employees. They're going to stay. But this is about engaging that group that's in the middle. It's not your star performers, and it's not the laggards in the organization who we know we spend much too much time trying to manage, but moving that middle group and getting them to want to stay in our organization. These numbers prove it, and can be replicated in any organization if you have the ability to generate this kind of data.
Yeah, and I think, Zach, the moral of the story is that in this particular nursing population, some recognition is better than no recognition. More recognition is better than some recognition. And a lot of recognition is better than some recognition. So, as you go up the line, as you recognize people more frequently, you basically save much more in turnover costs. Now, again, what we don't want to say is that people who leave only because they weren't recognized or they didn't receive enough recognition. And you can certainly even argue that, I think, even more closely at the bottom end when, the people that aren't recognized at all, perhaps they weren't a good job fit or they had issues with their managers or whatever. But the people at the top rungs, the people that, in the top 25%, the turnover is only 6%. And I'll even amplify this more and say that the top 10% who were recognized, basically among the top 10%, recognition was, I think, only about 4% annually. So even better as you go up the line, and the people that were recognized the most, very, very small percentage of annual turnover.
Yeah, I always struggle with how do we engage that each group, the high performers and the middle performers, and how do we get those middle performers, those players who show up every day in our organization and give us their hearts and their minds, how do we show them the love? And how do we get them to stay? And how do we get them to perform just a little bit better? And recognition is clearly a tool that does it. Whether you're driving a safety program, whether you're driving a customer service aspect of a program, recognition in each of those areas will generate higher engagement. But what this study shows is it will actually generate lower turnover costs. And that lower turnover cost can be quantified and used to support increasing recognition budgets in our organization. Something that's been a real struggle to maintain in organizations where the margins are shrinking, to say, give me more money for recognition. Here's something that can actually prove that works.
Yeah, and I think that this slide, too, actually gives a bit more detail in terms of the groups that we've been describing. The no recognition group, which was 9%, the median length of tenure over the 3.5-year period that we studied these folks was half a year. So, these folks that didn't get any recognition at all didn't even make it an entire year. The people that received minimal recognition, and that is, basically this particular group, 16%, got recognized, a couple of times, given the length of their tenure, about twice a year. And then the people who are in the modest category, a little bit more, about 3 times a year. And then when you see the more recognition group, which is the 50 to 75th percentile, 51st to 75th percentile, when we looked at the amount of recognition that was given, those folks were recognized about more than once a quarter. But then the people that received the most recognition, that top 25% that had only a 6% annual turnover, those folks were recognized 4 times a quarter. So about once a month.
And point out that the 3.5 years is the maximum you could have stayed under the study.
Right.
These could be people who've been with us for 20 years, or going to stay for the next 25 years, but they did not leave during this study at all. So people who got high levels of recognition stuck with us, or stuck with whoever their employer was, in a tremendous way. But the quantity of recognition is important. And how do you drive the quantity of recognition? It's not about the employee of the month. It's about 4,000 employees of the month. And how do you get each one of them to feel as though they're being individually recognized? And it's hard to do. It's hard to do unless you can leverage technology to create a culture of recognition. Because when you can leverage technology, you can easily increase the quantity and quality of the recognition. You can drive accountability. Which managers are recognizing? Which ones aren't? Buck that up against the turnover rate. Buck that up against an employee engagement rate. So now you have 3 metrics to look at how important recognition is. And you can then measure recognition and its effects on the organization, whether you want to look at safety or engagement, or customer service. But let's take recognition from something that we know that we need to do, and something that we know that we could do better, and we know we could do more of. And let's use technology to get us something that can actually do it, quantify it, and drive accountability with it.
So just to make some final comments before we respond to some of the questions that we're in, again, we don't want to say that recognition is the sole reason why people stay or leave organizations, but we know it's a critically important factor. And the data not only supported, in the WorkProud study that we did, but now we can see those relationships actually borne out in real behavioral data that we've looked at over this 3.5-year period. And also, when you assign the dollars of what that represents according to that SHRM formula, it's essentially in this organization, which is a large organization, it basically every one of those tiers of recognition represents potentially millions of dollars of turnover costs saved. Now, Zach, you've worked in this area, based on your experience, does this data bear witness to your experience in terms of the cost of turnover, and do these numbers for you as a human resources executive pass the smell test?
Yeah, sure. And you know what? Let's say we're off by half. Let's say we're off by half. We're still talking millions and millions of dollars with a recognition budget that's probably in the hundreds of thousands. Most organizations do not have the kind of recognition budgets that really support great recognition programs. And how do you get more money into your recognition budget? Well, you got to show people some hard numbers to get there. And this approach proves that. But like I say, even if we're off by half, even if we're off by 75%, we are still talking significant ROI and significant cause to invest in employee recognition.
Okay, so at that point, Michael, do you have some questions for us?
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Garlick and Zach for the introduction, and watching some of the questions coming in and the questions that we already have. There will be ways in which one could cut and dice and challenge the data collection processes and methods, and there'll be some limitations, as there always is. The first premise or assumption, both from our side and to further Zach's comment, is to say, look, there's a need to quantify this. I would assume most of us, if we're in HR, inherently know that if you're not being appreciated or appreciating others, there's a problem and a challenge. And one of the difficulties we have is, we manage things that we measure. So what we're intimating here, both through the study, is this is measurable, and it's done in a way that is fairly blind. I'm sure there are some circumstances where there's some voluntary turnover and circumstances that are taking place outside. But the sort of cold data said, let's look at recognition activity being generated by our systems and overlaid against turnover rates. Again, there are going to be reasons. But that begs or gets us to the place that we think is really important, on the WorkProud and the technology platform provider side. And that is, the absence of recognition becomes just as powerful and valuable to the organization as the presence of recognition, in that the absence of recognition tells us that, let's not necessarily say there's a problem, but we'll certainly say there's a management gap. And then to drill in, asking questions, why? Why are these people not being recognized in the first 6 months, when we all inherently know the turnover rate in the first 6 months is the highest? We invest huge amounts of money sourcing them, then onboarding them, then trying to get them established. And the summary is, at the end of 6 months, nobody noticed me. Nobody made me feel like I was part of the team. Nobody acknowledged the contributions that I made. So I left. What a waste of money. How short-sighted the organization is to have wasted and invested so much in potentially great talent when these are all avoidable, right? And they're avoidable partly to inspire, to make it easy to recognize and appreciate and share good energy amongst people. What person under the age of 30 or 40 doesn't pick up their mobile device 200 times a day? How many times is something positive coming down that pipeline straight to the breast pocket to a deskless population that says, I see you, you're good. You're in India, you're in a different shift. I don't get to see you. And therein lies the big gap in most organizations, and acutely so in stressed organizations, RNs, organizations who are highly demanded, RNs, different shifts, RNs, and don't sit there in front of their email looking for the next Slack, Teams, or email message. Of course, as people would be thinking on this call, the best recognition is me coming down and coming over to you and putting my hands around you and giving you a hug and telling you emotionally you're great, and a handwritten note from the CEO. You get a lot of those. It's not feasible when you're at scale, right? So you've got to go, Some of us may have teenagers on the call, right? Teenagers. My teenager texts me. My teenager goes to their bedroom first. That doesn't mean that my teenager and I have no relationship. It's, remember, generationally, things have moved along. And digital communications through mobile devices is a core part of the way people interact with each other. All right, so let's go through some of the questions, and we'll go through as many as we can in the time available. Dan Panachida, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, asked a great one. How do you counteract managers' tendency to take a minimum effort approach?
Well, I think that's a great question. And when I've spoken on this topic, I've likened it to the wife who asked her husband after 5 years of marriage, honey, do you still love me? And the husband responds and says, I told you on the day we got married that I loved you. If anything changes, I'll let you know. And it's very much the same approach that a lot of managers take. If you don't hear me complaining and you don't tell me that there's something wrong, then presume that everything is fine. And I think that, all the data show that that's not enough. It's not enough that some managers think that getting your paycheck is sufficient recognition. Keeping your job is sufficient recognition. All the data show from many, many studies, not just our study, but from countless others, that employees need more than that. They need that ongoing encouragement and affirmation, or they leave. So managers who take the minimal approach are basically just setting themselves up for these high turnover numbers. And that's really what the data show. And when you can show a study like this in this industry or your own organization that can directly relate turnover percentages to lack of recognition, it provides the kind of ammunition to justify and really change the culture into a culture of recognition from one of just sort of minimal activity.
Yeah, there isn't enough time in the day to do recognition, right? I have all these other things to do. And you want me to do recognition also? Yes, we do. Well, show me that it's worth my time. Okay, here's some data. We'll show you that it's worth my time. Okay, now we're going to put it on your performance evaluation, how much recognition you do compared to others. Okay, now you're going to evaluate that. CEO is going to speak about it. CEO is going to, advocate. C-suite officers are going to advocate for more recognition. They're going to do it also, but you got to make it easy because they have the same problem the rest of us have. How much time? At the end of the day, give me a tool. Give me something easy. Give me something I don't have to train on. Give me something that I can do quickly when I have a free moment. And maybe I'll do it. And then I'll start to see how people like it. And then if they like it, then I'll do more.
Yeah, so I want to just add to Zach's. The tools that I used are fundamental. And the application and use of mobile technologies is a key enabler and a spot that nobody focuses on. But first thing in the morning, everybody looks at their device. Last thing at night, before or after they kiss their loved one, they looked at their device. And 200 times a day, they look at their device. And the device is very powerful. And it can convey all sorts of information and messages, including, in this case, the ones that say, I see you're new, you just onboarded. Hello, team, I want to introduce you to your new team member. frequency of recognition, light touches. I appreciate you. I see the great things you do. Leadership coming in, scrolling through the feeds, tapping and liking, sending messages and notifications. To answer Zach's question, ease of use, ability to use it. All right, let's go to some of the other questions. How to best spark engagement, recognition, and in turn retention with a hybrid workforce. Maybe Zach, some of the things that you had in time seen deployed work well as far as how to get some momentum.
Yeah, the hybrid workforce is clearly a challenge. I think healthcare is still delivered pretty much locally. It's hard to be a nurse remotely, or at least a bedside nurse remotely. And those are the jobs that we're having the hardest trouble filling. So putting our effort into recognition and retention activities around the at-work workforce. The hybrid workforce is more, and it's not only more flexible in terms of who wants to move into it, but also in terms of your recruit, how far away you can recruit. Because if there are remote workers, they could be working anywhere in the United States. So once you start to increase that market, that labor market, becomes less of a challenge to recruit. But it's those bedside folks. I mean, why do we focus on nurses in the study? When Rick showed me the study, I was like, let's look at the nurses. They're the bedside ones. They're the ones we need to retain. They're the ones we need to put our efforts into. You know, yeah, those accounting clerks, they're important too, but I gotta find nurses. I gotta stop driving up the wage rate of the nurses, which is pulling up the wage rates of everybody, cutting into the margins. So it's really, to me, about the folks who are present in the workforce and the folks who are present in the bedside.
Well, and I think also, just to make this real quick interjection, that digital tools make recognition much more easy in this era of remote and hybrid work. You know, one of the things I just did a study with the IRF, the Incentive Research Foundation, where we showed that 70% of people still go out and buy gift cards at retail. Well, how do you distribute those gift cards if nobody comes into work, right? Or people are only partly in the office. So these electronic delivery systems and electronic tools like, you know, Michael, the one that you promote in the marketplace, are really good for addressing those hybrid and remote work situations.
And work is still a social experience. It needs to be a social experience. And it's hard when everybody's in a mask and a gown. But here we can take that social experience and put it in an electronic format that's easy to use, that builds social communities, that builds social structure in the organization, whether people are remote or on site. We may not be thrilled with the fact that we have to build our social networks electronically, but that's what's going on. We don't have much choice. So let's go out and get the best tools we can to drive that.
Question, what types of recognition are there, and what recognition style most influences the employee? So I'm going to selfishly at least take the initial response, and that is the question of recognition as a separate activity from, let's say, general positive feedback, some communications, onboarding, reminders about wellness programs, maybe some other reminders of activities, celebrating volunteerism, etc., is the key message about where this is all going. And that is, these should not be seen to be these siloed, separate initiatives by companies, for the employee doesn't care about the fact that there are these different siloed experiences, from onboarding, from first month, from 6 months, from 1 year, from birthday, from years of service, from the other cool things that the employer is offering and saying to the employee in that experience contract. In the employee experience contract between the employer and the employee, good things are supposed to happen to the employee as a result of good things being done by the employee to better the organization, its customers and clients, and the other people that work there, of which acknowledgement of good work, and I see you for being important and a contributor, can take many different forms, and so it should. And technology is not replacing the human touch points where that's available. It's augmenting it and supporting it and allowing it to happen at scale and telling you when it's not happening at all. So when people are asked questions like, well, what type of recognition works? Or should it be monetary? Or we don't have a lot of budget. I'm like, none of those matter. They're the construct that you have to work with. You do your best with the budgets that you can, and you argue in favor of increasing budget. Maybe your government, it's difficult to get a monetary award. Nobody said anything about a monetary award. And the data that Zach and Dr. Garlick are even talking about don't even correlate to whether the monetary components are there. For we have clients that are spending large amounts of money on monetary awards and non-monetary recognition appreciation. But companies should have a strategic imperative to create good experiences for employees, and positive feedback and recognition are key enablers to create those positive experiences that goes along. And if you've got some money, great, put magic dust money points and rewards on top of it. And if you don't, but make sure you've got really good recognition, and it puts a little bit more emphasis to better recognition. So,
Michael, if I could just add to that, when the Incentive Research Foundation sponsored a study that I did a couple of years ago on how people like to be rewarded and recognized. And it's available on the IRF website. But one thing I'll say is that different people have different ways of how they like to be recognized and by whom. And it's really critical to understand like what people like and what they don't like. For example, I did a study years ago that showed 8% of the workforce, the best way you can recognize them is by giving them more work to do. Now, a lot of people would say, well, you can keep that kind of recognition, but there are some people that love their job so much and they want to advance, they want to develop themselves. They like to be given more responsibility as a way of recognizing them. Some people like to be recognized publicly. Some people hate that. So there's different ways that people like to be recognized through different modalities. And it's just critical to understand, your employees, how people like to be recognized, because sometimes the best intended recognition can backfire and not be seen rewarding at all. If I'm put in front of a public audience and I'm not a public person, that might not be seen as rewarding. So it's just really critical to understand how your employees like to be recognized on an individual basis.
And add to that, what do you want to accomplish? So for instance, if you're in a safety program and you're trying to increase peer coaching and peer checking, you want to have availability of peer-to-peer recognition. On the other hand, if you're trying to drive recognition around new hires, you're going to want that to come both from a top-down and a peer-to-peer approach. So there are times when hierarchical recognition is appropriate. There are times when peer-to-peer recognition is appropriate. There are times when parties and professional recognition is appropriate. What are you trying to drive? Let's create an overall strategy around recognition and then drill down to each of the tools that are available to help us get there. And maybe monetary rewards is part of that, and maybe it's not. But let's at least have a strategy of recognition and not, oh yeah, we should do some more recognition.
So again, having seen hundreds of programs deployed for different companies, they don't look the same. They vary based on history, legacy, culture, logistics, and so forth. But the commonality that we're now seeing and the overarching trend, and one of the big sort of points from today's presentation and the data that supports it, is this is 100% ubiquitous. And if you're not using this as a platform to begin to communicate positive recognition, feedback, appreciation, well-being, onboarding, you're missing the huge opportunity of doing two things. One, making sure you can get 100% success rate in delivering. Two, taking advantage of the fact that this exists in every single person's pocket. And three, that you can begin to aggregate and collect data that tells you where it's happening and what things they're engaging in. Some clients we see have no monetary budget and do significant amounts of recognition and feedback. Others have layers so that you can have a non-monetary experience, a monetary experience, and an evolution experience. But in every case, in every client, utilization rates continue to increase over time based on the amount of activity, onboarding, recognizing, celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, milestones that take place through the program. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy so that HR can see it evolve and grow and develop and mature so that it becomes something that is meaningful, that touches the employees. And if it touches the employees, as Dr. Garlick and Zach Lipner showed in today's data and from their experience and perspective, you'll reduce turnover rates. And so you'll save money. It's something that should be done. All right, I got time for one more question. I'm going to do my best. And again, we're going to do our best to respond and follow-ups from the questions. People asked some great questions, so sorry we couldn't get all of them today. Was job performance controlled in the data or taken into account? Or how did you guys approach, the research and the data from that perspective? What granularity do you feel comfortable in intimating, or what could be done if people were interested in delving deeper with us in this question?
That's a great question. And, where we're limited, and just a very fair question, there's a lot of data that we didn't have access to, job performance data being one of them. What we really want to do is take this research as a starting point for building it out and refining it so we can get more granular, because we think that there's a lot of value in understanding this at a deeper level. Right now, I'm working with a company to try to develop a platform that can integrate all of this data, including all the recognition data that Michael collects, and performance data, survey data, and all the rest of it. So exciting things on the horizon, but no performance data was not at this point taken into consideration, but it's on the roadmap of something that we'd certainly like to integrate into this kind of analysis.
So I think we've got time for one more. Zach, maybe you want to respond to this budgeting questions, how to develop an approach, leadership on the question of budgeting, both maybe historically what you've done and or how maybe a study like this could help in looking to present a business case.
Yeah, I think it starts off with getting an organization to agree that recognition ought to be a strategic initiative and not simply a tactical thing that we do every once in a while to make people feel good. It ought to be strategic. So we ought to pull together all of the recognition programs that we have out there. We ought to find out which ones seem to be working, which ones are not working, where are the gaps. And then we start to monetize it in terms of the cost of turnover around. But it has to start first with getting C-suite folks to say, let's stop and let's create a strategy for recognition the same way we create a strategy around capital improvement, or the same way we create a strategy around safety. It certainly dovetails into a lot of those programs. So the safety folks have a recognition component within their organization. The customer service folks have a recognition component within their organization. Let's strategically look at how we can pull all this together and how we can create programs that are meaningful and effective, and how can we leverage technology to increase the amount of recognition. Because as the study showed today, when you increase the amount of recognition, quality aside, type aside, all of those things are important, of course, but just in terms of raw numbers, you see the impact of recognition on reducing turnover and on longevity. So now let's come up with a strategy that says, okay, we have a strategy, we know what we want to affect, we know what we have. Okay, how do we get there? Let's look at the technology that can help us to get there and allow us to measure it.
All right, well, thanks, Dr. Garlick and Zach, for your time today in doing the work on the study.